Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And today we're going to cover the classic Hal Draper piece, Anatomy of a Micro-Sect, because we're in a time period where the left is fragmenting, again, whatever the left is. The idea of the clearinghouse of the sects that was manifested in the DSA's regional strategies, which largely involve caucuses, which are more or less sectarian caucuses, seems to be hollowing out. We've seen a return to the old post-70s sect formations with some new weird trysts. So I figured it might be worth going back over Hal Draper's words about this, talking about the Maoist and Trotskyist milieu in the 70s, from a piece he wrote and distributed privately in 1973, and it was republished for the Center for Socialist History, and then put again on Marxist.org. And, this is one of the most covered Marxist essays that gets talked about, but it's important to go over it. Hal Draper, The Anatomy of a Micro-Sect in 1973. The original title of this document was a position paper by the Independent Socialist Committee, which is a kind of precursor to the International Socialist Organization. This was not a membership group, but an educational and publishing agency in its original form. The first page brought a long footnote explaining the paper's use of the term sect. It is better presented here as the introduction to the essay. Introduction. There is a terminological problem. Sect is often used as a cuss word to mean a group one doesn't like. Movement is often used to describe something that does not exist in an organized form. Yeah, that's a problem. And when the American socialist movement is used as an abbreviation for the scattered socialist elements that often do not move at all. We use these terms with a more precise meaning. A sect presents itself as the embodiment of a socialist movement, though its membership organization, whose boundary is set more or less rigidly by the points in the political program, rather than its relation to the social struggle. And I would add to that most of these political program points are actually ideological and are not organic to the class, either in itself or for itself. Back to this. In contrast, the working class party is not simply an electoral organization, but rather electorally engaged or not, an organization that is really the political arm of the decisive sectors of the working class, which politically reflects the working class in motion as it is. A socialist movement shows up the mass manifestation of socialist working class in various fields, not only the political, but usually around the mass socialist party. For the present purposes, there's an important distinction between the sect form of organizations and a form of organization common in other countries, but does not yet exist in this backwards country. This is this approach is basic to the paper, for it essentially deals with the question, is there an alternative to the sect mode of organization which dominates the whole history of American socialism, past and present? And is there an alternative? Hal Draper. That was originally a footnote. All right. About the road to an American socialist movement. Since there are socialists in America but no socialist movement, it is understandable that socialists will say, let us go and form a socialist movement. All considerations argue for this obvious step, but there is no argument against it except one. This is the historical fact, that no one can decide to make a revolution. Whatever is formed by fiat will turn out to be a sect alongside the other sects, even if it is a better kind of sect which believes in not being sectarian. Like the DSA. Let us make clear from the onset that we do not have an answer to this $64 question. Viz. A formula or gimmick which, if only followed, will invariably produce a party or movement out of the woodwork. Yeah, I'm tired of people promising that they can do that with no prior success at doing it and no proof that they have ever gotten any organization more than 1,000 people off the ground, or the $5,000 person, not dollar, average sect limit for the big sects. We will all have to grope for some time, but let us have some conceptions about the direction in which to grope and the criterion for deciding whether developments are hopeful or hindering. We got to remember, this is actually during the beginning of the new communist movement, which was full of sectarian organizations. The CPUSA had weakened, and splits had emerged, particularly after the interest period, where a bunch of Marxist-Leninist groups tried to enter the SDS, and it busted itself up. And then the McGovern campaign failed, and so sects were the obvious way to deal with it, was going back to more, quote, radical and demanding programmatic groupings, but there being, hundreds of them, and they're not really getting off the ground beyond that. All right, the road forward. A socialist movement will become a possibility in this country, as it did in others, as its bases are matured by social political conditions. Okay, Hal Draper, what are the conditions, though? If, however, it cannot be created simply by an effort at will, it is also historically true that it is not simply a matter of spontaneous generation. When the basis for a socialist revolution mature, it will be difficult for it to come into being unless a nascent movement is crystallized with the help of active socialist elements. Every socialist movement has been the outcome of the fusion of spontaneity and leadership, and of naturally developed elements and conscious organization. So Draper here is precursoring something like McNair's merger thesis, actually. And for those of you who don't know, the McNair merger thesis, which he derives from the Second and Third Internationals, is when a socialist movement, which is both within and outside the working class, merges with a larger workers' movement. This means that for us American socialists today who look forward to building a genuine socialist movement, there is a course we can take which will further this objective and bring it nearer, which will fructify the ground on which it will arise, which will make it easier for the elements to mature from place to place. The alternative to creation by fiat is not that we passively wait for it to rise by itself and without the intervention of human hands. No economism here, basically, is what he's arguing for. Neither immiseration or evolutionary developmentalism in the economy will bring about what you need for socialism. It follows that the course taken now by the American socialists can also have the opposite effect of turning off dispositions towards the genuine movement, of sterilizing the ground on which the seeds of the movement might germinate, of making it harder for the workers to find their way to a socialist movement in the making. Unfortunately, it is this latter course which today is dominated amongst the sects, sects, and micro-sects of what passes today nowadays as American socialism. The sect form of American socialist groupment today is a roadblock in the way, and the sect notions that are dominant amongst this groupment constituted poison, which could immobilize and abort a socialist movement even if it got started. Fragmentation. American socialism today has hit a new low in terms of sect fragmentation. Yeah, that was a huge deal in the 1970s, and it's a huge deal again. We're seeing this happen again. In some ways, there are major differences between the new left to new communist movement to disillusion that we see from the mid-60s to the early 80s, from what we've seen amongst the millennial and Zoomer left, which emerged in the anti-war movement through Occupy, into BLM and the Bernie campaign, into Bernie campaign 2 and BLM 2, and which seemed to start to decompose back into sect forms during the Biden administration. And in some ways, the Biden administration actually plays a similar role to the Carter administration in kind of finishing a lot of the popular frontism off, but not replacing it with anything. But anyway, back to this. There are more sects going through their gyrations at the moment than have ever existed in all previous periods in this country taken together. Max Elbaum talks about this too in Revolution of the Air. And the fragments are still fissioning down to the sub-microscopic level. Politically speaking, the average has dropped from the comic opera plane to the comic book grade, where the esoteric sects, mainly Trotskyist splinters of the 1930s, tended towards a sort of super sophistication of Marxism and futility in practice. There is a gaggle of grouplets now, mainly Maoist and Castroite, characterized by amnesia regarding the Marxist tradition, ignorance of socialist experience, and extreme primitivism. That sounds similar today as well. People who are basically trying to reinvent a way to socialism from just inverting American anti-communism, and it leading them to be very vulgar and ineffective and overly focused on the internet and superficial engagement therein. The road to an American socialist movement surely lies over the debris or around the rotting offshoots of this fetid jungle of sects. To be sure, we recognize that there are sects and sects. We still have with us some sects and sectlets of the classic type, mainly feudal and fossilized, as distinct from the new crop of neo-Stalinist, Maoist, Castroite, etc., sects that represent a more positive danger to any healthy development in the working class movement. It is characteristic of the latter that they do not want a class movement, not because of some special organization conception, but because they're basic political conceptions. Just as their socialism is just a rule of state despotism over a bureaucratically collectivized economy, so their organizational role to power is a formation of elite band of maximum leaders, which holds itself ready to bestow its own rule at the propitious movement on an elemental upsurge of the people. This is new only in the sense of it being a regurgitation in new forms of the oldest type of left movement, the Jacobin Punchist circles that dominated before the rise of Marxism. This is left Boulognism, Blanquism, the Mountain, Jacobin itself. You can go on and on and on. The kind of the attempts at building a left Bonaparte movement in France, which was very, very, very common in the various revolutionary periods, it often didn't go anywhere. All right, if these neo-Stalinist sects are oriented towards the working class, or towards the lumpen poor, or the blacks, or the third world, etc., it is only in the sense that men in a hurry orient towards a pack of horses. They make it clear that the historical content of Maoism and the different varieties is the conception of the bureaucratic revolution from above, engineered by a band of self-appointed leaders riding on the back of a class movement and bridling it. This is, sectarianism on Draper's part. It's not totally false, but it's not fair either. For which end, the most suitable class is the one with the minimum capacity for initiative and self-organization, such as the peasantry. Ouch. These elements are, for some reason of class makeup, enemies to the revolutionary democracy of socialism. Hence, also, these elements need a sect form of organization. For them, the sect is not an unfortunate necessity due to the absence of real movement. It is their movement. Minuscule size may not even be a drawback. For didn't Castro make the revolution with only umpteen good men? How many commissars are needed on a long march? This is indeed part of the dynamic behind the current proliferation of sects, since they are not inhibited by a prejudice that the party needs to be much of a rank and file. The classic sect. As for the classic sect type still operating, these presently divide more or less into those that stem from the Trotskyist sect tradition and those that exemplify the social democratic pattern. To be sure, the Trotskyist grouplets shade off at one another at one end into the neo-Stalinist type, particularly the larger sect called the Socialist Workers' Party. This is about the SWP endorsing the Cuban Revolution. See the article there, Trotsky and ours, whose politics have steadily moved since Trotsky's death in the direction of Stalinization. What characteristics the classic sect was best defined by Marx himself. It contraposes its sect criterion of programmatic points against the real movement of workers in the class struggle, which may not measure up to its high demands. The touchstone of support, the point d'honneur in Marxist word, is a conformity with the sect's current shibboleths. whatever they be, including programmatic points good in themselves. The approach pointed by Marx was different. Without giving up or concealing one's own programmatic politics in the slightest degree, the real Marxist looks at the lines of struggle calculated to move decisive sectors of the class into action and to movement against the established powers of the system, state and bourgeoisie and their agents, including their labor lieutenants inside the workers' movement. And for Marx, it is this reality of social class collision which will work to elevate the class consciousness to the level of the socialist movement's program. Asterisk. I do think it's interesting that today most of the large sects actually still come from this Trotskyist tradition. There's some of these new communist sects still around, particularly some Hojoist ones. Most of the Maoist sects, except for the Revolutionary Communist Party, Bavavakian, are relatively new. And a lot of the Marxist-Leninist sects actually were Marxite Trot sects until relatively recently. The PSL is a split from the WWP, and the WWP was Marcy's party. All right, back to this. To move a fighting sector of the class into action against the established powers by only a step is more important than 1,000 programs. Marx and Engels used to reiterate, and there's no use in denouncing them for depreciating programmatic politics. To the sect mind, their approach is utterly incomprehensible. For over a century now, we have seen the two touchstone, and the difference is as glaring nowadays as it ever was. The most important test has always been the relationship of the self-styled Marxists and the working class organized on the elementary economic level, the trade union movement. The test is more decisive in the United States, where, unfortunately, the trade union movement is the only class movement of workers in existence, and it's been getting smaller since this was written, steadily since this was written even. Sects and trade union. The sect socialist has always felt a soul-torn difficulty in the face of the trade union movement, which rejects socialism, and the dominance of the sect life in the history of socialism has been accompanied by the predominance of leftist hostility to trade unionism as such. Marx and Engels constituted the first socialist school to hold a position supporting trade unionism as such, while critical of given policies, leaders, etc., of course. And after their time, socialist history divides mainly between the social democrat types, who supported reformist trade unionism precisely because they were themselves reformists rather than Marxist, and the would-be revolutionary socialists who founded revolutionary arguments for returning to the old crap of socialist anti-trade unionism, with the addition of Marxical rhetoric to dress up their sectist approach. I mean, I see the Marxist words being used in ways that don't have any meaning is super common right now. An example of this would be recently I was called on the Sublation comment section a petit bourgeois nationalist for, I guess, being against the Israeli incursion into Gaza, since they said I was for national liberation, which I am in the terms of Palestine, but I'm actually kind of skeptical of it as a left-wing principle in and of itself in all instances. But it just doesn't mean anything when you use these words this way. And the common defense is, oh, we are speaking for the class for itself, which is, of course, in our already existing programmatic sect language, which is basically just projecting some ideal type of class to the conclusions which you already have. Not a very meaningful statement. But it is a good thing for LARPers to do. So, you know. Very few of the so-called or self-styled Marxists have understood the heart of Marxist approach to proletarian socialism. The basic strategy for building the social movement lies in fusing two movements. This is literally the merger thesis of McNair. And this is why there was, back in the early days of the base building tendency, there was a time period where people tried to combine Draper and McNair into a kind of new Marxist center, both the center, like the Second International Marxist Center, and the center and what Draper thinks Marxists should do when there's not a mass movement. Because they both basically agree on the merger thesis, but they really don't agree on a whole lot else, and I could go into that later. The class movement for this or that step always gets a decisive sector of the class into collision with the established powers of the state and bourgeoisie, and a collision with possible with permeating class movement with the educational propaganda for a socialist revolution, which integrates the two. So this is the educational form of the party. If this has been true since the best days of the Marxist movement to a greater or lesser extent, it took grotesque forms in the recent past of the American left, i.e. during the 60s when the radical impulse was temporarily coming from non-worker sectors, students and some blacks not rooted in the working class life, for example. The student you left commonly swallowed the image of labor dished out by the sociological brainwashers of the academy. Big labor alongside big business, etc. Identification of trade unionism with George Meany or Hoffa, and implicit equations of trade union movement with its bureaucracy, organized workers as ipso facto middle class stratum and part of the establishment, and the rest of the ideological garbage from the real establishment's anti-working class mind mills. And, you know, Draper's basically saying so much of this came out of the university movement, trying to differentiate itself basically from its parents. And that's actually kind of true from this time period, because the expansion of the universities after the GI Bill, particularly once you're dealing with people coming back from Vietnam, is an expansion of people who are from the working class, but not of it. Even among those new left elements, the better ones who oriented towards going to work in the factories or plants, going to the people, the precursor to the base building tendency. The dominant conception was that trade unions such had to be replaced with more radical formations of shop organization, which would somehow be outside of the trade union structure without being a dual trade union. So this is Sects within the trade union, the IWW, that kind of thing. These conceptions either remained in the realm of fantasy while making it impossible for their holders to integrate themselves into the real movement as trade union militants, or worse, were acted out destructively in certain places, bringing harm to the workers and discredited the radicals. Nowhere did the new left impulse into the factories eventuate into more or less well-rooted movements of militants inside the trade union movement that could really offer opposition to the established bureaucracy. This is an indictment. And that's still true, although left salting in the world hasn't led to people being able to stand up to trade union leadership. In fact, usually they carry water for it. All right, the sectist approach to the class movement showed its pointed ears in many ways that need illustration here too. Item: the student radical, heart filled with sympathy for the poor workers, turns to the farm workers' struggle as one clearly meriting his support. He simply does not go to the people by going to work in the fields with other workers, for should his special talents be buried under a clod, he goes to work for the union. And we see a lot of this, and Jane McAlevy's work was used to justify this, even if this is not something that her work should actually have been used for, i.e., as what the union calls a student volunteer. Impressed by his own self-sacrifice on one hand, and on the other, he finds the farm workers' union scarcely measures up to his ideal of what class struggle should look like. Pretty soon, he complains that the student volunteers have no say in the policy, i.e., he demands that the powers of decision be partly shifted out of the union members' hands and into those alien class visitors who have designed to donate their time. This is the subordination of the professional part of the union. Or finding the internal life and democracy of a union are far from satisfactory, he may decide that the farm workers do not deserve his support. A lot of people who did this became third worldist. He would bestow his savings presence only on certified class struggles taking place on a different planetary plane, aka far away. We definitely see that today. Item: the trade union movement has a very behindhand in producing opposition to the Vietnam War, as well known, while the anti-war feeling grew around the campuses. In student circles, the programmatic touchstone for the complete opposition to the war came to be the slogan of unilateral withdrawal, which was richly justified. But finally, here and there, pockets of anti-war opposition in the trade union movement did start developing. Eventually, a number of the more socially conscious and progressive labor leaders did screw up courage and founded the Labor Assembly for Peace in the teeth of the violent denunciations by the meanie bureaucracy. These beginnings were timid in many respects, and among other hesitancies, stated opposition to the war without specifying the slogans of unilateral withdrawal. We know no more flagrant example of the sect mentality than the scornful attitude taken by new leftists towards the beginning of an organized anti-war opposition in the labor movement. Even in the San Francisco Bay Area, which had the most militant and most wide open branch of the Labor Assembly for Peace, and where leaders of the group, if not the group itself, spoke out for unilateral withdrawal, not a single new leftist eligible could be persuaded to taint his soul by having anything to do with a group so backwards as to fall short of the unilateral withdrawal program. The fact that this development represented the first steps of a responsible sector of trade unions moving into collision with the establishment powers, this fact meant nothing to the sectist. The only consideration they understood was their soul-saving shibboleths, which they counterposed to the real initiation of class motion. The rut we are in. Such is the road of the sect. How do we get out of that rut? There are two notions to try to remedy the ills of sectism by broadening the sect. The intention is good, the remedy impractical. One is the proposal to abolish sectarianism by a call for unity of all the sects, which is basically what the DSA under Bhaskar Sankara's calls from Jacobin magazine attempted to do, which was a clearinghouse within the DSA and a popular front outside of it. This obviously didn't work. This may also be presented as a road to forming a socialist movement. It is a piteous illusion. In practice, it means a spate of unity negotiations amongst the sects, a common time-killing enterprise, or even unification or two, a drop of the bucket. But the actual unification of all the sects is an inherent impossibility where the programmatic shibboleths on which the sects are based are politically incompatible. The product of sect unification turns out to be nothing but a somewhat larger sect, as long as the conditions for genuine socialist movement do not obtain. The idea of an all-inclusive sect is a will-o-wisp. Incompatible political programs can be held together, at least for a historical period, within the framework of a party movement. For the cement that holds such a formation together is its role in the class struggle itself, the fact that it is the class in movement. What holds an antagonistic political tendencies in place is the pressure of their class enemies outside. As long as this is not a real situation of movement, nothing else can take its place, including exhortations against sectarianism. The second proposal is one that aims at the same result by a different route, via launching a sect whose distinguishing programmatic point is that it will voluntarily eschew distinguishing programmatic points. Yeah, I tried to do this once. Just going to point that out. This is to be achieved by limiting the program to some minimum socialist or radical basis on which everyone can agree, i.e. a statement of abstract socialism. If the left wing wants to push the group to a revolutionary position, like no support to Democrats, an old one, the minimum is exploded. In practice, therefore, the program must be reformist. The Socialist Party, and the DSA, its successor in some ways, has wanted to be this kind of sect for most of the time since it ceased to be a mass movement, and more recently the New American Movement, which is actually the other part that formed the DSA, if you want to know where that came from, has set out to concretize this aim in some still unclear form. So yeah, in many ways, this is what we actually tried around the Bernie campaign, going all the way back to stuff that happened when Shachtman killed the Socialist Party of America, and then the Social Democrats of America and the Socialist Party USA emerged in its aftermath. The Socialist Party USA stayed independent, but the Democratic Socialists of America had a populist alliance with the Democrats and eventually joined with the New American Movement in the early 80s to make the DSA, which grew in leaps and bounds, particularly in New York during the beginning of the Reagan administration, but then stagnated almost at about 5,000 members for literally a generation and a half until it was reborn around 2014, because Jacobin's calls to respond to the failure of Occupy led that to be the sect of which the clearinghouse of the sects wanted to go into. But I mean, to be fair, I have tried to do this myself. Like, I have tried to have non-sectarian or trans-sectarian movements. Sometimes the aim is derived by reminiscence from different historical periods before 1917, when the Socialist Party was a congress of different political views which were not yet consciously understood to be basically antagonistic, and whose consequences had not yet been acted out. But we cannot simply pass a notion to go back to the Debs era. Sorry, people. I agree with that, by the way. As long as the life of the organization, whether or not labeled a party, is actually based on political distinctive ideas rather than on real social struggles in which it is engaged, it will not be possible to suppress the clash of programs requiring the different actions and different forces. The key question becomes the achievement of a mass base, which is not just a numerical matter, but also a matter of class representation. Given a mass base in socialist struggle, the party does not necessarily have to suppress the internal play of political conflict, since the centrifugal force of political disagreement is counterbalanced by the centrifugal pressure of class struggle. Without a mass base, a sect calls itself a party cannot suppress the divisive effect of fundamental differences on, for example, supporting or opposing capitalist parties at home in the shape of the liberal Democrats, and such are supporting or opposing maneuvers of the communist world. What then? If the road of the sect is a blind alley, what then? And if the two ways to get out of the sects also lead to just creating bigger sects. The road of the sect has always been a blind alley, yet the socialist movement has come into existence. There has never been a single case of a sect which developed into or gave rise to a genuine socialist movement. By the only process that the sects know, the process of accretion. The sect mentality typically sees the road ahead as one in which the sect, one's own sect, will grow and grow because it has a correct political program, and until it becomes a large sect, and then a still larger sect, eventually a small mass party, then a larger, etc., until it becomes large and massy enough to impose itself as the party of the working class in fact. But 200 years of socialist history, this has never actually happened in spite of innumerable attempts. Yeah, I point this out all the time, and people don't listen to me about it. This is no proof that it will never happen in the foreseeable future, but it is proof that there must be some other road to the formation of a general socialist movement, which is not the road of the sect. That road has been nigh totally forgotten in the general sectification of socialist circles in our period. The slightest acquaintance with Marx's view of what is to be done to build a socialist movement is enough to remind that Marx was violently and unconditionally hostile to anything resembling a sect. Not only did he never organize a Marxist sect, he positively scorned those who did. It is less easily understood that Lenin never wanted to form a sect and never did so, and that the Bolshevik Party was not a result of a sect formation, but that grew by accretion. When Lenin came out of exile in 1900 and went abroad to begin the struggle to permeate the existing socialist circles with the ideas of revolutionary Marxism, he never thought to set up an ideological grouplet of his own, a sect, even though the Russian socialists in exile were already divided into sects, which were already splitting, etc. What Lenin helped to launch was a Marxist political center in a non-sect form, in the form of a periodical manned by an editorial board, Iskra. The political center itself educated for full revolutionary Marxism, and at the same time, the party movement it called for was an all-inclusive socialist party in which the revolutionary Marxist center would constitute one tendency, hopefully eventually dominant. Both sides of the picture conditioned each other. Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first all firmly and definitively draw lines of demarcation between the various groups' tendencies, wrote Lenin on launching Iskra. But the lines of demarcation were not drawn along sect lines whose organizational walls bounding them. This was the sect course which he did not follow. Iskra was not merely a literary enterprise. This is a misunderstanding. A worker in the Russian became an Iskraist insofar that he agreed with the political views of the political center, and that an Iskraist, he himself, became a political center for further spreading those views in the popular circles in which he worked, in his factory, in his village, in his socialist circle. One of the views spread by the political center was that the party movement to be built should be a broad one, Lenin never gave up this conception of how to build a socialist movement at any time before the October Revolution, and it was on the basis of this conception that the Leninist Party actually evolved. We do not propose either that the Russian movement or Lenin's course as a model for America in the 1970s. Good, because it wouldn't work. Definitely wouldn't work now. The significance of the case is different. On the other hand, it is many of the sects that they believe are following Lenin's footsteps and building a hard sect on the basis of a shibboleth program. They are wrong because in this belief they have merely internalized what they have been told of the nature of Leninism by anti-Bolshevik industry of American establishment, aka they're just inverting anti-communism. That happens a lot, and it isn't new to social media, although social media has definitely led to a lot of it. On the other hand, the case of Lenin's road to a revolutionary party is important because it can be applied uniquely. His unique course was to be serious and uncompromising about maintaining a revolutionary Marxist political center as an instrument in permeating the whole movement with its ideas and insisting that the majority so gain to be recognized by the whole movement. It was the right wing that split. We do maintain that the alternative to the sect road, which is suggested by the successes and failures of socialist history, is also suggested by generalizing from Lenin's Iskra a model as well as from a dozen other cases of building of real socialist movements in various contexts and circumstances. 7. The political center. What should be done to prepare the ground for the eventual formation of a socialist movement party in America, that is, a mass-based socialist formation, which is the political expression of the working class moving towards a collision with the established powers of the capitalist society? We first address ourselves to the individual socialist who wonders what he or she should and can do other than join the sects of his choice and waste his energies in the vicissitudes of sect life. You have the opportunity for understanding a two-sided socialist enterprise keyed to your own circumstances. We suggest the following double-barreled liaison for you, both sides of which are necessary for the whole thing to be meaningful. 1. Your basic contribution to the eventual formation of the socialist movement is what you do to develop a socialist circle around you where you are now. We are thinking in the first place of your role in the workplace, factory, school, office, whatever. First things first. What American working class movement needs first of all is the crystallization of the organized militant opposition in the trade unions, because this is the existing class movement of the workers and the only one. You might argue for tennis units today being part of that. It would be a sad sectarian mistake to think of this as a radical or socialist opposition, even though it will inevitably be powered mostly by radicals and socialists of sorts, but also inevitably lead its militants to think in radical and socialist terms. What is needed is a broad progressive wing of the labor movement. In Marxist term, this is adequately defined as a wing which advocates for class struggle unionism against business unionism, whether it defines itself in class struggle language or not. From the point of view of the worker, there is a felt need to carry on militant union without getting mixed up with socialism and Reds. From the point of view of the socialists, the organization of the militant opposition to union establishment sets up an elementary school of class struggle socialism. One consequence, for example, is bound to be the politicization of the trade union movement, its entry into independent political action, which depends in turn on breaking up its attachment to the Democratic Party politics, something that we have never actually achieved. Sorry, Draper. This opposition must be a loyal opposition. This means loyal to the interest of trade unionism in the same degree that it fights the boss and the bureaucrat whose power is not in the interest of trade unionism. It is necessary to proclaim this today, to put it on a banner, so to speak, because the sect radicals have so successful in discrediting themselves before the conscious trade unionists and confusing radical trade unionism with the sect's commando raids to rip off a plant situation by displaying a militancy even if the workers' interests are harmed, or the union work is wrecked, as long as a couple of members are recruited to the sect. The sect is to operate in unions and plans to subordinate the workers' interests to their sect advertising adventures, and sorties are enemies of the working class and of socialism, not merely misguided radicals who are to be chided in Marxistical editorials. They are not adventuristic allies of our camp in the class struggle. They are wreckers who cannot always be distinguished from police provocateurs. any militant opposition movement in the trade unions which makes alliances with such elements deserves its fate. If you are in regular contact with a number of people and in the workplace or some other mass situation, whom are you trying to influence in a socialist direction? Then you are doing something. What the future socialist movement needs is a network of informed socialist circles, or formal ones, if you will, which have an integral relation to the real struggles people are carrying on. For the same goes for the Black movement, the women's workers movement, and the student movement, etc. You may be accustomed to the belief that only members of the sect are interested in such work, but this is not so. There are innumerable cases where cells of militancy have sprung up in the workplace, school, office, or school around people who are not even socialist and do not know what they are, or do not know they are, excuse me. What is true is that the membership in a sect often been the stimulus to undertaking this role through group pressure and guidance, and that the sect performs the service of providing reading and study materials, etc., for circle activity. This points to the positive side of sect work, which we cannot deny. What this means is that the socialist efforts along these lines need an assistance of political center of some sort, to which one can look for literature, advice, and help. Moreover, there soon arises the need for separate individual circles and efforts to be linked up. But to the role of the political center need not be carried by a sect. Historically, the job has been done most often and most successfully by a paper or other publications of the Socialist Political Center, which organize simply an editorial board or an editorial enterprise. Arguably, Jacobin did this before they started liquidating into the DSA. Iskra was one of the only dozens of examples of how this was done as the socialist movement came into existence all over the world. Historically, also, political centers of this sort have frequently undertaken organizing functions as their influence spread, the organizing being the product or byproduct of the work of its agents and representatives. Iskra agents were organizing arms of the First Leninist Center. The point would be utterly lost if the enterprise were to be considered merely a literary enterprise in the usual bourgeois sense. There is a continuous line which has carried such political centers from their function as producers of literature to the role as centers of the stimulation of organization in one form or another. Such political centers are operating today in this country alongside proliferating sects, and often quite effectively. Naturally, it is a question of political centers which will widely varying political complexions, most of them distasteful to our own views and to each other's. We mention them not to celebrate their work, but to exhibit alternatives to the sect road. The Guardian and Sweezy's monthly review have functioned more or less as political centers emerging from the neo-Stalinist tendency of one kind or the other. Indeed, the Guardian is now involved with the brace of neo-Stalinist sects and taking up the formation of a Maoist party out of their unification. On the right-wing social democratic side, the critique of literatures around dissent functions only as a political center for the tendency that exists outside of George Meany's offices. These examples differ in the amount of attention they pay, or have paid at other times, to the function of relating to their readers, followers in the field. For our present purposes, we wish only to stress that a political center does not have to be a sect. More, a political center can undertake a relationship with its followers which is not bedeviled by the rigid requirements of organizational life, its life and death votes, faction fights, splits, internal disputes, and ingrown rituals of imitating a miniature or micro-mass party. From the point of view of the individual socialist wanting to do something, we should summarize our suggestion as follows. 1. Crystallize a circle of co-thinkers around you wherever you are. In the course of your activity in the arena of social struggle that goes along with your situation, you are the smallest unit political center there is. 2, make contact with a political center that makes sense from your point of view for help in literature, advice, and outside link-ups, and work with it to whatever extent you find useful. But there is no reason against having this relationship with more than one political center if they suit your own political views. Such a political center may even be a sect, but if you do not join it, it relates to you only as one political center amongst others. I use like sectarian materials all the time. This relationship is a hang loose relationship, and if you do not have the vote in deciding its affairs, it is likewise true that it cannot tell you what to do by exerting its sect discipline on your own judgment. You do not erect an organizational barrier between you as its adherents of one sect and someone else who cleaves to another sect or none. And you use whatever literature you wish, whatever their source. You will use your money not for the sect's funds drives, but to finance your own work. If enough take this course to break up the sect system, then it would be a good thing for the future potentialities of an American socialist movement. There is a better chance of a genuine socialist movement arising out of low, hang loose complex of relationships than it is out of the fossilized world of the sects. We are not under the impression that a very large number of individuals are going to start tomorrow by following the course we have described above. I mean, obviously they didn't. We have been interested so far simply in illustrating the way in which socialist movements have arisen elsewhere, the only way in a broad outline. We have sketched the kind of development which provides an alternative to the sect mode of organization which is driving American socialism into the ground. I mean, this does kind of require you to be a member of a union to effectively do, or to be a member of some kind of advocacy group, but it is not a sectarian approach. Anyway, we're going to need to finish. Very likely, what will happen in this country will happen somewhat differently as usual. If the springing up of socialist circles is not happening on a mass scale, it didn't, although those socialist circles that sprung up in the end of the 70s are the ones that actually inspired the stuff in the aughts and the aught teens. So there is that. Although we seem to have a repetition compulsion, so it didn't really help as much as we thought. It is also true that there is no direction visible in which the emergence of a mass socialist movement is just around the corner. All you can do is push in a direction in which one's effort will not be wasted, no matter what the outcome. The only thing we can be sure of is that the world of the sect is a dead end. The Independent Socialist Committee is itself an effort to establish a political center for our current revolutionary Marxism. The views of the workers of all countries constitute the class base of the third camp, which must fight and destroy both the capitalist system and the communist bureaucratic collectivists if the revolutionary democracy of the socialist world is to be established. I mean, this is not as relevant today since the communist bureaucratic collectivism doesn't exist that much. All right. It began as an editorial board for the production of books and pamphlets, not yet a periodical, embodying the case for this world outlook. In this way, we are exemplifying our own advice. And I think it's interesting that the Monthly Review is still around as one of these formations. The Guardian is not so much. This is not the same Guardian as the UK Guardian. But Jacobin Magazine effectively was one of these. But so many of these groups have liquidated into something else, or they degenerate into parasocial attachments, which are not politics, which is not something that Graeber really saw, because I don't think those kinds of parasocial relationships, having access to mass media, like truly mass media, like television, was not a thing, whereas today we can do a lot of the stuff through semi-mass media and social media, which changes the dynamics somewhat considerably. Anyway, on that note, I'd like to thank some new Khan Kohanans who support the show. You can become a Khan Kohanan and have more input into the show by signing up at the $10. But if you don't have that kind of money, and a lot of people don't, I get it. We have a version for as little as $4 a month. Or we release, like, I release more things for free than not. I mean, you do get additional material behind the Patreon wall, but I do release a lot of this stuff for free because I believe in it. And I don't even monetize it when I release it for free, which probably doesn't always help me, but nonetheless, it is what it is. So I'd like to thank our new Khan Kohanans. Matt and Matt. David S. Matthew, Mark M. Red Wolf, Lindsay K. Jordan S. Nico V. Mike, Shane, Gabriel C. David G. B. Berger. Cam. Little Toaster. Hunter Miller. Adriel M. Brandon L. Danny from the Valley. DRV. The Will Quaid. Trey. Paul H. Harpreet C. Thomas P. Aaron H. Adam B. Lyle C.E. Jim D. Golden. Irish Legend. Strom M. Real Person. Alfonso D. Christopher. Evan M. Slavic Dreams. Devin. Etc. Etc. Bela Lugosi is red. Unread. Okay. Lincoln H. Exo Andra. MK. 496. Joshua B. Ben W. Joseph M. Jonah H. Philip R. James F. OS 12. Zach. The Virtual Jonathan. Longbeard. Mason K. Joe P. Sif. Aurelia V. John G. Alas Pure York. Joker. Nicholas H. John G. Christopher S. Callisto L. Gerard DT. On your left. And Devin F. again. Slavic Dreams. Flesh Damakura. All right, that's all the people that I need to thank for their patron shout out. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Protect your peace.